Hey, this week we've got a great show for you. Kevin Van Dam is going to teach us how to approach a lake we've never been to before as we go in depth. Then Rick Clunn is going to show us about gimmicks versus legitimate fishing techniques in the art of angling. But first up, here's Edwin Evers taking us fishing on his favorite river techniques in this week's Fishing in 4.
One of my most favorite times of the year to fish. You know, it's early fall, and I love to go to the backs of these creeks. You know, you get back up here, you see deer, you see turkeys, you feel secluded back here, and the fishing a lot of times can be phenomenal. You know, we're gonna really focus on laydowns and logs in this creek, but especially in the outside bends. Man, he clobbered that thing. That's a nice one. I like catching ones like that. Come here, buddy. Come here. All right. Ooh, that's a chunk. Look at that fish. Man, that's a good one. What the fun up? Pull up. I think I got him on that right there. You know, when I'm approaching a creek in the fall, I keep it really simple. There's about 3 baits that I like to use. A BB5, which is just a balsa B crankbait, shallow diving, really comes through cover really great. Laser eye spinnerbait, either a 3/8 or a 1/2 ounce model, depending on how deep I'm wanting to get the bait. Chartreuse and white. Then finally, you either need a tube, like this Fiber King tube, or a jig. You can't go wrong either one of those. They're kind of interchangeable, just whatever you have the most confidence in. You know, but the main thing about these creeks is, you know, it's just shallow water fishing. You don't, you know, you're not going to be out there fishing real deep water. You can cover water pretty fast, and you're making pitches to visual targets. And there's just not a lot of people up in there doing that time of year. Most people are deer hunting. It's just a lot of fun to do, and you can catch a lot of big fish doing it. Oh, there's one right there. Man, he got me right at the boat too. Chunky little old bass. His tail's kind of worn off, I guess, from earlier in the spring from spawning. You know, when you're going to be fishing creeks in the fall, you know, one of the main things you'll be fishing are laydowns. And I always want to visualize where I think the best hideout is for a bass on that laydown. A lot of people will approach them and they'll cast all around the perimeters and then make a cast on the inside of it. I tend to be different. I want to put my first cast in the absolute best place, the heart of that laydown on my first presentation. And the reason for that is, you know, a lot of times if you're throwing around the outside edge, you know, you're making that bass aware that somebody's there. Or you might actually, you know, bring it over a branch and shake that laydown, and it just, you're giving awareness to that bass. You know, that a lot of times on that very first flip in the heart of that laydown, it's a reaction strike. It's just one of those things you need to think about when you're approaching laydowns. Pick a specific spot on that laydown where you think the best fish is and put your bait there on the first cast. Man, he came up right on top of the water and got that thing. That was so cool. I was bringing my bait right over the top of that log, and I mean, he just come up on top of the water and just killed it. You know, fishing these creeks and rivers and the tributaries that come into lakes, you know, they can be overwhelming. There's miles and miles of water, and it all looks the same. It all looks really fishy. You can't fish it all, and what I try to do is I try to focus on basically 3 things when I come into a creek. The outside channel bend, the mouths of creeks or ditches that come in, or the upstream and downstream of little islands. Those are what's different in this creek, you know, and that's why I try to focus just in on those areas, you know, to make the most of my time when I'm in here.
Kevin Van Dam has fished enough lakes to know when you go to a new lake, you better have a plan. He shows us how as we go in depth.
Today we're going to do something a little bit different. Probably the #1 question that I get asked by guys when I go around to tournaments and seminars is, how do you go to these big lakes and go out there in just a short period of time and find these bass to do well in tournaments? So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the way that I approach a new lake and the whole process that I go through to find the bass. One of the things to remember when you come to a new lake like this, or even if it's a lake you've fished your whole life, is that every time it's different. You know, the water levels change, the season changes, the bass are moving throughout the year, and you have to adapt with them. So I try to gather some basic information before I'm going to go to the lake that gives me a starting point. First off, I want to know the general seasonal pattern, and I really watch the weather close. You know, the Weather Channel is a big key for me. I'm going to watch the weather as I'm getting ready to go fishing to this lake, and then try to get the weather while I'm going to be there too. You know, the forecast. It can change a little bit, but that gives me ideas on what the fish activity levels might be. And then when I actually get to the lake, I can visibly assess it. One of the first things I want to do is look at the water clarity itself, the water level. If I can get a reading from the dam operator, if they're generating any current or anything like that, I want to try to get all that information that I possibly can. And if I can compile that with a good map and get a good starting point for the lake. Well, today we're on Falcon Lake down in South Texas. It's a great bass lake. It's the first time I've ever been here. But one of the first things I want to do is assess the current conditions that we've got. If you look around, you can see there is flooded brush everywhere. About 2 months ago, this lake was 18 foot lower than what it is right now. We're here in October, so we're kind of in the late summer period. Typically right now, the bass would be on offshore structure, but whenever you get a fast influx of water like that, a lot of the bass will move shallow, or they're going to move shallower on the structure spots they're at. You know, with all these deep trees, they'll move up and suspend in the top of the trees. Something that really determines that is the water clarity, and that's probably one of the most important things that I do when I get to the lake, is really look at the water clarity. You just drop a bright colored spinnerbait down and see how far it goes till it disappears. What I really am looking for is the light penetration level in the water. So right now I can drop it down and it disappears within 2 feet, so it's got a pretty good stain to it. And anytime the water's dirtier, the bass are going to be a little bit shallower. So I know that the light's probably going to penetrate 8 or 10 feet down like that, so I'm going to really concentrate on structure places like that and really fish up in the water column a little bit. Another key factor is the type of forage that you have. You know, in the fall of the year, late summer, you're gonna, have most of the bass feeding primarily on bait fish, and this lake is loaded with tilapia and shad. So I'm gonna think about that with the lure choices that I have and the patterns that I'm gonna choose. I'm gonna try to, pick colors that match that natural forage. So now that I've assessed the conditions, I wanna look for areas that fit that seasonal pattern. That's what we're gonna do next. One of the things that I really like to do to a lake, especially a big lake, is I want to see a lot of it with my eyes to know really what it looks like. I mean, you can look at it on a map and you can kind of see where the creek channels are and see where the flats are, and that's very important. But I also want to see the land around the lake, the trees around the lake. All that is important to me in figuring out patterns. So I like to take and just drive around and physically just look a little bit. I want to cover most of that water. Areas that I look for in the summer like this is, there's tons of flooded cover up here, and some of the bass always go shallow, but the biggest part of the population is probably going to stay deep offshore. So I'm looking for these long flats that come out and drop off into the river if possible, and if you can find areas like that with creek channels and ditches, that's what bass need. After I've kind of determined the seasonal pattern and I've looked at the water clarity, I want to rig my rods to use lures that are efficient in finding bass for the circumstances that I have. With all this flooded brush and cover, I've got a lot of depth zones to look at, and I need baits that I can fish through that type of cover. So I've got some deep diving crankbaits, some shallow running swim bait type crankbaits. I've got several jigs, some plastics for flipping, and always have a spinnerbait. I can cover a lot of depth zones with that. And all these baits I can fish fairly well through these mesquite type bushes and things that are here. And that gives me baits that are efficient. That's the main thing, is I want to be able to cover water fast. When I'm looking for bass, I want to go into an area and fish through it pretty quickly and try to determine a pattern. I don't have to catch every one that's there. Every bite that I get is going to give me a piece of the puzzle that's going to help me develop patterns and things like that. So I want baits that I can cover that water quick with, and most importantly, be efficient at the depth zone that I'm trying to check. That's why I've got baits that I can go from deep to shallow with. Down on the end of this point. There's a good start right there. I really want to use baits that I can cover water with fast, and you really got to think about the depth zone. And that's just a good solid fish right there. But you know, when you're trying to cover deeper water and be efficient, it's hard to beat a crankbait. Not only does it cover the water real well, but it gives me a real good feel. And even here, you know, I mean, there's all this flooded cover and brush up there, and there's going to be some fish up shallow, but I know that big schools are still going to be living in this offshore type structure. There's a lot of bushes that are flooded, you know, 18, 20 foot down, growing up off the bottom, and those bass will get in the tops of them. And you can crank them pretty efficiently with a big plug like this. You know, the bill will keep them from hanging up a lot. I'm going to use heavy line and try to get down in there, but this is a great way to find fish a little bit deeper.
Going to a new lake can be intimidating, even to the most seasoned angler. But one thing I've learned, no matter where I've been throughout the country, is once I start catching fish, I get comfortable. And a bass is a bass, no matter where you are.
There he is. Oh, a good one too. What we catch on the Bass Pros right there. If you want to catch more bass like that, you better be watching. Another one. There's a school there. Anytime you catch one this time of year, there's a good chance you're gonna catch more. That's a good one right there too. That's the kind we're looking for right there. He barely hooked. That crankbait is just so efficient, and that's really what I'm looking for when you're searching for bass, just trying to get a few bites. Because I can always come back with a jig or something else and try and catch those fish, you know, the rest of the school. But when you're looking for them, I'm just trying to get a bite, and I can kind of tell by the way he bit it that he really didn't want it, you know. I mean, that's a nice one right there. A good solid one there. When I finally do come in contact with a bass, it's so important to pay attention to every detail that happened when you got that strike. It doesn't matter if you catch a 5-pounder or miss one on the topwater. That gives you the clues that you need to help put together the pattern. I want to know exactly what happened when I got that strike and how he took the bait. You know, was he on the sunny side of the bush or the shady side? Was the wind blowing? Was he up current, down current? You know, how deep was he? If I make a long cast and hook a fish, I'm gonna troll right over to that spot, look at my sonar, see what's down there, see how deep that fish was at, see how he was positioned. All those things are gonna help me duplicate that pattern to catch more fish. When the water's warm like this and I'm trying to get these fish to react, you know, a spinnerbait or a crankbait, just cast it out there and reeled straight back to the boat. Doesn't get many bites. You know, I want it to bounce into the cover if I can. If there's nothing there, I'm gonna make it look like it's got something wrong with it. I wanna give the bass a reason to think that that lure is gonna be an easy meal for him. So I'm gonna stop and start my crankbait. I'm gonna jerk it, I'm gonna twitch it. I'm gonna rip that spinnerbait up off the bottom, let it flutter down. I'm gonna take a jig and hop it real quick. I'm gonna use heavy jigs, heavy worms, things like that that fall fast to trigger that reaction strike. I don't want the bass to think about it. I want him to just snap at it. And that's how I'm gonna catch him in the summer. There's two ways to do it. You either gotta finesse him real slow or you gotta make him react. And I prefer to cover water and make him react. When those cranking fish get going, boy, it's hard to beat. There's nothing that'll put a big limit in the boat faster in the summer than a big plug for me. Another solid one. That's a big one right there, boys. Yeah, what a fooled me. He's foul hooked. God, did he hit it though. It's important to pay close attention when you get a strike to how the bass took the bait. They'll tell me if I need to stay and fish there longer. You know, if you throw a crankbait out there and you reel it down and it bounces off a stump or hits the bottom and one just really nails it, you've got the right presentation, the right color to get that aggressive strike, and there's probably going to be more bass there. I want to get him in and get right back out there again. But if I get a real subtle bite or a short strike or the fish is barely hooked with my crankbait, that tells me I might need to make an adjustment. Maybe I need to adjust my lure color or my presentation to get that fish to aggressively strike the bait. You know, if he's biting it real timid, something's not quite right, and I want to adjust something to try to get that fish to bite a little better. The one thing that's real critical is I like to run my GPS and I have it zoomed in real close when I'm idling on this stuff because I can see exactly where I've been. It helps me grid search an area. I can check a point and make sure I'm not driving over the exact same spot that I was just a minute ago. You can see that you're just a few feet over from your last line through, and that really helps you triangulate what's under the water and see what's down there. It doesn't take a big fancy boat and a lot of equipment to catch bass, but one thing you definitely don't want to skimp on is you don't want to skimp on your electronics and you don't want to skimp on your eyewear. These two things right here will find you more bass than all the rest of it combined. There's a lot of different ways that you can approach a body of water that's new to you. The system that I've showed you today has really worked for me. I've got to find bass in a short amount of time, no matter what time of the year, no matter what conditions are, and no matter what type of lake it is. This system gives me a lot of confidence to fit my style. If you use some of these techniques, I think you can apply it to your style and you're going to be successful at finding fish at any new lake that you go to.
How many gimmicks have you fallen for in your fishing? If you're like most people, probably more than one. Today, Rick Clunn takes a look at what's a gimmick and what's a legitimate fishing technique in this week's Art of Angling.
You know, one of the more humorous things I've observed over the years in fishing is this continuous search for the gimmick. In other words, the secret lure that will always catch fish, or something that gives you an advantage over your buddies. And there's probably legitimate ones, but most of them are not legitimate. But a friend of mine, one time we were fishing a tournament, his name was Elroy Kruger out of San Antonio, Texas, and we were getting ready for a BASS tournament. And the night before, we're getting our tackle ready and all that, and all of a sudden I see him reach down. He had a white hot spot, and he had a blue marker, and he was painting a blue circle around every eye, about 3 different hot spots. And of course, being young and naive, I said, Elroy, is that really important? He laughs, because he was trying to tutor me, and he says, no. He said, I'm doing this strictly for the benefit of my partner. If I can catch 3 or 4 fish before he ever catches one, I don't have to worry about him the rest of the day, because he'd be in the bottom of the boat. He ain't gonna have a blue eye one. He's gonna be figuring out some way to paint a blue eye around every hot spot he has in the bottom of the boat. He was a very smart fisherman, but it was a psychological technique, because he knew so many fishermen were gullible for looking for that little magic gimmick. So I'm trying to get you kind of to enjoy that, but to avoid those same little things to happening. But there are legitimate ones. For example, in the early days, they didn't make suspending rogues and jerkbaits. Back then, 15, 20 years ago, they didn't make them. The first ones I saw were actually coming out of the Ozarks, and guys would actually wrap lead wire or soldering wire around the hooks to weight their baits and suspend them. And that could be a gimmick. And this was a cold water technique, and at first, you know, that kind of looked like a gimmick, but as it turned out, it wasn't. And one of the biggest strings I caught in my career life was 6 bass on Kentucky Lake in a BASS tournament. 4 of them were smallmouth. They had 32 pounds for 6 fish, and it was just on a suspended bait before suspended baits were made. So here was what could have been a gimmick in the beginning, now actually became a very functional way to use bait certain times of the year. So what I'm trying to get you to do is to just be more aware of this type of thing. Some gimmicks, like that's all they are. And if you get caught up in and just wanting a gimmick every other tournament, then you're kind of like a gimmick addict. It's really more important to see, does it really have a real function, or is it just a placebo effect? Because the problem with placebo, even though it might work, it's temporary.